Boom, what's happening, beautiful people? Welcome to another episode of the Real Drug Talk podcast. Today, we're talking about the vaping ban that is coming in Australia and all the policy issues that surround it and go with it. So to talk about that, I've got Rebecca Lang on the podcast. She is an alcohol and drug policy wizard, and she's the CEO of Quinata, Queensland Network of Alcohol and Other Drugs. They're a peak body organisation that advocates for policy change, specifically in Queensland, but she is advocating for change in lots of different things on the national space as well. So she's a wealth of knowledge to pick her brain around policy issues and everything that's going on with vaping. It's a highly interesting story, and we know people are interested in it off the back of the newsletter that we sent out the other day. So that's coming up in the podcast today. A couple of quick things before we jump into the show. If you like what we're doing and you're picking up what we're putting down, we would love it if you would leave us a review, like, subscribe wherever you listen to us. All that stuff really helps us to hack the algorithms and jump up and reach more people, and potentially help someone, which I know that the podcast has helped a lot of people. So we'd really love it if you could do that if you're a regular listener and you haven't done that already. Also, we're changing things up this year and investing heavily in the content, and to do that we're putting out some advertising spots and doing a few different things around the podcast to monetize it a little bit. So if you again like what we're putting down and want to be kind of a bit more of a part of the team and reach the audience that we reach with your products, services, ideas, whatever it might be, get in contact with the email that we'll put below in the podcast notes. We would love to have you on board and chat to you about sponsorship. So I'm going to stop banging on. Let's jump into the podcast with Rebecca Lang. Peace. So maybe to start, can you talk us through just the overall policy space of the vaping and what's kind of happened in the last, I don't know, it's been about a year, I think, that this has kind of taken effect, that we've had some changes in the policy space with it?
Yeah, so I guess if you want to go, this all kind of started about 5 years ago when the then Minister Greg Hunt, in his concern for people accessing disposable nicotine vapes that had really high levels of nicotine in them and were being picked up by people who we'd prefer didn't use vapes, decided that the solution to that was to make liquid nicotine prescription only, as though the only use for liquid nicotine would be smoking cessation under the direction of a general practitioner. Now, you can pick on that a lot because most people who quit smoking don't use their general practitioner to help them do that. But fast forward 2 years, then you've got a new health minister kind of dealing with what was probably the inevitable consequence of making liquid nicotine prescription only, which is that people want liquid nicotine because they do. And where there is a demand, there are people who will fill that demand, particularly when it's in a grey space where you're not sure whether what you're doing is legal or illegal. So what that kind of promoted was people would sell vapes and they just don't say that they've got nicotine in them, but they definitely do have nicotine in them.
Yep.
So the solution to that from the current, not the health minister specifically, but the advice that he's getting from the bureaucrats around him is the same advice that every health minister has always been given, which is we ban it, we tell people not to do it, problem solved.
Problem fixed.
Yeah, I mean, and then I guess we stand in front of a giant seizure of whatever the product we want to ban is, and we declare that we've won, because now we're telling the community not to do it. And we're cracking down on suppliers. So, that's where we're up to. That's the bit we're up to right now.
Yeah, and it's kind of interesting for me learning of people like yourself and just kind of living in reality, I guess. like that seizure photo came out. I think that was a week ago or a week and a half, 2 weeks ago, something, whatever it was. And we see those seizure photos of like people in front of cocaine or ice or whatever it is all the time. And you might see that on the news on like a Wednesday, and you go out on Friday night and you still see plenty of people using cocaine. You know what I mean? It doesn't seem to stop the problem, does it? Yeah.
No, prohibition has never, ever, ever succeeded. Not for any substance in any country or for any population group. When people talk about prohibition, my usual go-to comeback is to say, well, meth has never been legal, but nonetheless, when we survey the population, everybody who wants to find meth can do so. So it says to me that the solution we've got is kind of a bit one-sided. And I think the problem is that our kind of regulatory structures at the federal level aren't allowed to see people and to live in a real world where, we have a tolerance for the fact that, well, wait, no, actually our regulatory, they don't seem to think that anyone would do something without explicit permission from them to do it, which I think is a fundamental misunderstanding about the way people make decisions in their lives generally, and particularly around substance use. The lack of good quality harm reduction information available to the community means that most of the time when our governments go out and say to people, don't do this because X, Y, and Z, like people are like, oh, my friend's been vaping for years and doesn't have any problems, or oh, my friend does meth on the weekends and they're just fine. So there's that kind of, the reality gap is, I'm saying, Jack, you're not the only one experiencing this reality gap. Like it's a real thing. Yeah.
It's interesting. So a couple of things that I want to ask you off the back of that. And I kind of know the answer to some of this. But for the people out there listening, probably the first question that comes into their minds is, you're talking about prohibition, but the laws are vaping is going to be prescription. So it's technically still legal with a prescription. Why is that, in your view, and in many other people's view, like the wrong way to go about it to regulate the space?
Well, because essentially it medicalizes you don't go to the GP to buy Panadol because you don't need their advice around Panadol. That's available over the counter. So, in a world where tobacco is still sold in shops, where I can buy nicotine lozenges in my local supermarket, or I can buy an inhaler in my supermarket here in Queensland. The bit particularly for this is that you're trying to restrict people's access and make them have a conversation with a health professional, but really, in the absence of being able to close off supply for tobacco, totally, what you'll end up doing is displacing people back to smoking tobacco. Because they don't want to go talk to a GP because they just enjoy using tobacco. They're not looking for advice about it and they're not looking to stop. And so the other obvious problem is that, I don't know about you, Jack, but all I hear is people around me talking about how hard it is to get an appointment with their GP for anything. So why we want to take up that system's time with nicotine is a bit curious to me, when actually nicotine, when we know what's in it and we can control the content of delivery through regulation, where's the need for the health professional in that conversation? And I blame the TGA for that, because the hint is in their name. They're the Therapeutic Goods Administration. So when you ask them a question, they're going to give you the therapeutic goods kind of response, right? They don't live in a world where people, they don't regulate alcohol consumption because alcohol is not a therapeutic good. And in fact, alcohol is probably our better proxy for how we should be regulating access to nicotine liquids and vaping. Because the other thing we know is this cat, it's not only out of the bag, it has moved several suburbs away from the bag. So, we're not undoing this. There's no universe in which we will live in a vape-free Australia anytime soon. Sorry, you're quite right, Jack. The only people who have access to a GP and have prescribed nicotine will be the only ones using it.
Yeah. It's really interesting. The other thing that I noticed on the weekend, oh, now it's hailing here. It's all happening in Melbourne. Typical Melbourne weather,
Oh,
36 degrees, now it's hailing. Um, so the other thing that I noticed on the weekend with my mates, not to dob my mates in, but I noticed this with some people in my
you've got
family.
interesting names, by the way.
I know. Well, it's from the background that I come with. But we went into the smoke shop, and like with tobacco, the regulation and the prices that are so high now on tobacco, my mates were telling me that pretty much every smoke shop in Australia, you can go in now and ask for like imports, and they'll give you like an under the counter, like, you know, cigarettes that have been illegally imported, and that's at like pretty much every tobacco shop. You just got to go in and ask when no one's in the shop. So like, there's that policy space that's happened where like the the rates of smoking have gone down, but then it also like has gotten to a point where the prices are so high that it's kind of created this like really high illegal
Mm.
tobacco market. And I don't know if it's the same in Queensland, but in the news here in Victoria, there's all these like they're calling it like the tobacco wars, where everybody's like the organised crime are like obviously got their hands in the tobacco shops and they're setting fire to all the different tobacco stations and stuff like that. You know, like what's the balance of that regulation, or is that kind of the challenge for government and regulators, is to find that correct like policy space where it's regulation versus medicalized versus, you know, making things illegal or whatever it is.
Yeah, that's totally the part we're up to now is figuring out that. That's not where the conversation is at yet, though. So, firstly, yes, there are. I was in far north Queensland recently and remarked to a colleague how we had walked a block down a main street and there was and had passed 7 tobacconists. And I was like, this town really loves their tobacco. And my colleague, I won't name the town because I don't want to stigmatise them, but my colleague said that down the road from their workplace, there was a tobacconist who did not sell any legal tobacco or vapes. All they sold was illegally imported tobacco from Southeast Asia, chop chop. So illegal or grown in Australia but unprocessed tobacco, or vapes. And the fact is that, you know, the expectation from the Commonwealth is that those stores are being raided and shut down by police. But the reality is, as you know, wherever the outlaw motorcycle gangs go, they're going there because there's money in it, because people want to buy it. So absolutely the issue with tobacco control at this point is that it's so expensive to buy legal tobacco that we have seen the emergence and the growth in this illicit tobacco market. And the risk there, of course, is that people are buying stuff that's not labelled. Also, they are at risk of being criminalised for that. So, if you, I mean, you know, people would always say this wouldn't happen, but we know that our communities are not policed fairly or evenly. Data-driven policing means that certain communities are more likely to be targeted by policing activity. So, you know, if you're a young person of colour walking down the street in Cairns, you're more likely to have a conversation with police at some point during that walk than you are if you were me walking down that same street. That's just the nature of being a 40-something-year-old white lady. No one really sees you as a threat. So, and I'm definitely not asking police to engage with me more frequently than they do. I like not engaging with police. But the thing becomes, how do we then build a market that is broad enough that, because people don't want to break the law, people don't want the hassle of going through the justice system. Most people don't mind paying their taxes if they're reasonable. But the price point becomes, if I can get, you know, I pay $50 for my regular packet of cigarettes, if I can get that same thing for like $20, I mean, we're in a cost of living crisis. Of course, people are going to choose that. The other thing we know is that amongst the people left who smoke tobacco, are more likely to be people from socioeconomically disadvantaged backgrounds. So we're, you know, contributing to the cost of living crisis. And if vaping is cheaper than that, then I can see why people would make the choice to switch. And frankly, I think if you are still smoking combustible tobacco, then you should be looking at switching to vaping. I don't necessarily need you to cease and desist from all behaviours or go to your GP to get that. But I think we need to be making room in the market for people who just want to vape and don't want to have to explain why they want to vape.
Yeah. My big question is, what do you think is going to happen, and has there been any thought put into, like when SafeScript happened and, there was all the concern around, well, what happens with like all these people that are, taking all these medications and then it's just going to kind of drop off a cliff. Is there been some of the same concerns, with this vaping? Because when does it all take effect exactly? All the law changes and
the importation stuff has changed already. I think it started on the 1st of January, and then the shops, the purchasing the disposable vapes ban, if you like, comes in next month, I think. So yeah, I'm like you. I walk around, I see people vaping. I want to go ask them, do they know? Did you know the government made this illegal? Do you know that a month from now you could get criminalised for doing this? Because I think the government has an overblown notion of how much people pay attention to what they're up to. And I think if you walk into a shop and it's there for sale, like as a citizen, I think you've well within your rights to kind of go, well, if it's in the shop, it must be legal. So yeah, I'm a bit concerned about what might happen post the changeover. I think we're already seeing some of the really solid downsides of this approach, right? Like, I mean, I'm nearly 50. I've never known there to be tobacco wars in this country. I don't want to make light of people's shops being burned down, but like, clearly we're doing something wrong if tobacco is so valuable that organised crime wants to get involved in it. Like, they should have far more interesting things to get involved in than, like, for instance, maybe scouring the oceans for all those bricks of cocaine that have been floating around lately.
That's right. Yeah, people are all out there on their jet skis searching. So that's kind of the state of affairs. What would you say, like, what did you wish kind of happened, or what would be the ideal approach, just to kind of give the other side so that people can think about, well, what could this have looked like, and what is like a good, policy approach to a situation like this? Because it's bound to happen again with something else in the future.
Yeah, but it'll be cannabis will be the next thing, because, medicinal cannabis has been the pathway to legal recreational cannabis in 26 states in the US so far. And actually, I was in California last year, and like it becomes so mundane, Most of what's getting sold in shops in California is edibles, not or vapes, ironically, not joints or flour.
Yeah.
So, our system needs a way to understand that adults have the right to use substances that alter their psychoactive state, whether that's alcohol or tobacco or cannabis. In this instance, we'll keep it limited to those three because the other drugs have slightly more tricky kind of market profiles that are a bit harder to control. Well, I mean, I don't know how you legalise cocaine without doing something about the cartels that currently control production. Because those guys, maybe they're no worse than Elon Musk, but maybe they're much worse than Elon Musk. And I don't know if we need to legitimise their operations. You can see I've thought about this quite a lot. So my bit would be, what we need is a registration process by which we agree, like we do with alcohol, that there's labelling about what the purity and the content of what you're purchasing is. You have, I think it's a new style of regulations. It works a bit like a bottle shop, but with slightly more qualified people working behind the counter than, no offence to people who work in bottle shops, they probably know heaps about booze, heaps more than I do. But that gives people the opportunity to buy a range of products that are regulated for their content. Full stop, end of story. I think that alcohol is probably the best proxy we've got at the moment. That's regulated by the states. but the Commonwealth does have some responsibilities around taxation, for instance. So we should be looking at moving to a space where we can provide responsible adults with a choice to use a substance in a relatively safe way, or at least where the risks are known. And then we can deal with whatever's left in the illicit market once that's done. So, once all of the people who want to use liquid nicotine have access to that, then I suspect we might see fewer of these tobacco wars, because the market won't be there for organised crime to exploit.
Yeah. Yeah, it's really interesting. And the stuff that we know that works with alcohol, which we definitely don't do well in some areas, but is like, the limiting advertising, pricing is really important. So it's about giving people a choice, but also not kind of creating brands and advertising it to people. Like, you can have a balance of both, right?
Yeah, absolutely you can. And I think there's things to learn from the alcohol industry around how you might regulate to limit the growth of these mega kind of brands. Someone once told me you can trace every brand of alcohol back to 4 main companies that own those brands. And I think big tobacco is another great example of how we might limit who can be in the market. I think we know that larger corporations tend to prioritise profits. So we should be looking at closing the door, I suppose, in a regulatory sense on some of those big international companies that have proven themselves to be not that interested in the health of their consumers. And big tobacco definitely falls under that heading. Also, big alcohol probably does as well. So yeah, I think we just need solid regulation, and we actually then need to incentivize people to live within those regulatory bounds. So one of the things we do, and you're seeing it in the vape conversation at the moment, is that what's going to be allowed for GPs to prescribe is much less in terms of the concentration of nicotine than people are currently getting prescribed to use for smoking cessation. And we know that controlling cravings is really important if you're going to cease smoking. So if the vape isn't meeting the nicotine need, then people are going to top up with smoking on top of that. So, the getting the reality check into the science or the medical or the what we think is best for you kind of conversation is really interesting. Wouldn't it be fun if we were at a point where we had like a National Health and Medical Research Council guideline on vaping, as opposed to like the drinking guidelines?
Yeah.
Where they're like, no more than 2 per day, have 2 days off during the week, that kind of stuff. Imagine if we had that approach to talking about vaping instead of just, no, we don't know what it does. It's bad. It must be bad for you. Plus, You can't have any flavors in it because flavors are bad. I don't know why flavors are bad, but
because
apparently they are.
No, I won't make jokes. I feel like making jokes, but I won't make jokes. So what? And I actually don't know this, and maybe you do, maybe you don't. Is there evidence there about like vapes versus smoking, healthier versus not healthier? Like, is there strong evidence that shows that they're better for you or worse for you or anything like that?
So this is the interesting thing, right? Is like, from a common sense perspective, if you're not inhaling smoke, which is, if you're inhaling vapor, the conventional wisdom says that is less irritating for your lungs. So that's already a step up. Now, I should say I'm not one of the researchers behind this, so let's not take what I'm saying as a Cochrane review or something.
Yeah.
So there was, for a long time, people were saying vaping was at least 95% safer than smoking. The study that produced that result has been since kind of had quite a lot of shade thrown at it because it was either part funded or completely funded by one of the big tobacco companies.
Right.
Doesn't necessarily mean that immediately it's untrue. It just says you should be a little sus on the motivation of why they would fund that, because they're looking to shift um, their business model, if you will, into what is the nicotine future, I suppose. That's how I imagine they talk about it at their board meetings and strategy days. So I obviously don't spend a lot of time hanging out with big tobacco, because I bet their meetings are less fun than I imagine them to be. But you also see, like, they're doing, it's not just vapes they're moving into this space with. Like just today I was reading this article about nicotine pouches or pillows. There's a particular brand that I won't name that apparently is going mad on TikTok right now. And um, I read, the thing that most disturbed me in this article was they interviewed a young man from California who was talking about his nicotine pouches habit, and he's like, I'm an addict. All I can do is think about using nicotine, and I'm like, wow, watch how quickly people adopt the persona if it's presented in a particular way. I also thought to myself, I don't know if you can. I don't know. Well, I don't think anyone should apply that label to themselves. But also, I don't know if it's allowed for nicotine, because it's so, like, it leaves your system so quickly, and the withdrawal symptom is so mild that, I mean,
Yeah.
maybe it's you know it's it. I worry about locking people into that as an identity is a thing that worries me. But I mean, it speaks to, right, this new craze is coming out of Europe, so it goes back to, it's like an alternative to snuff. So nicotine has always been with us. It always will be with us. So I think we need to stop worrying about how to stop people getting access to it and start doing the work around, what we can throw shade at that study that says that, well, vaping must be bad because, we want it to be bad because we want to tell people not to do it. Let's do the work. Let's do the science. Sometimes you can't shortcut this stuff, and until there's a really good reason to cut it off, to ban, or to give people really strong advice about not doing it. I think you risk people thinking you're being a nanny state when you jump into that space. They're like, I'm an adult, I can make my own decisions. And frankly, I take a risk every time I get in my car. My life is not risk-free. So, in the context of different people's lives, nicotine use can actually be quite an important part of that for people. So, yeah, we just need to decorporatize and do some sensible regulation.
So everything that you're talking about, the evidence is really clear, particularly from, typical prohibition with alcohol in America and all the evidence from that and anything else that's ever happened. Why do we get stuck in doing the same stuff again and again and again? One thing that you say that always sticks with me is, like harm reduction is in our national policy framework, the approach that we're meant to take to substances. It's one of the last things that we often, do. Why is that? Why does that happen time and time again?
Oh, that's a good question. I feel like if I could properly answer that question, I could also bust open the kind of trope, right? I feel like the closest I get to it is that when 40 years ago, when Bob Hawke was crying about his daughter's heroin problem and announcing the first campaign against substance bad word abuse, we really only had a law enforcement frame for responding to substance use. So harm reduction was like, it was new as a concept in national policy at that point. The idea that you wouldn't necessarily require people to stop using, I think heroin was the drug most people were worried about back then. They didn't know that alcohol was much worse than heroin in those days. I wonder, knowing Bob Hawke being famous for sculling yard glasses of booze, I wonder if he would have been so keen on a campaign against substance use if he'd realised how people were going to come for his alcohol.
Yeah.
But because it's been led by law enforcement, I would now say, even 40 years later, if we do have a partnership between health and law enforcement, it's an abusive relationship that's led by law enforcement. They get to call the shots. Health gets to kind of come in afterwards and deal with the poor people who've got problems. I think we need to shift to a health-led policy, and that would that we actually probably would move away from the term harm reduction in some ways, because the harm from substance use is not inevitable. I mean, in other parts of the health system, what we call harm reduction would in fact be called health promotion.
Yeah.
You know, what information can we put in the hands of people so that they can make their own decisions in an informed way, and be aware of, if they are engaging in a particular behaviour, what the things to look out for are, to know if things are, if maybe things are getting a little out of hand and you might want to ask for some help. So my hope is that in prioritising harm reduction, when I say those things and the things we're in together, Jack, I sometimes feel like Captain Obvious.
Yeah.
But it is, I mean, it's human nature, right, to reach for what we've done before and think that it will work again. And frankly, we don't have a lot of really high quality bureaucrats working on alcohol and other drugs at the federal level in Australia at the moment, because the last 10 years they've prioritised people having management experience, not content knowledge.
Yeah.
And in that environment, I think the politics is what leads the conversation instead of the policy.
That's really interesting. I just want to touch on a bit more, because it's something that, like, I talk about it all the time on the podcast, so sorry for everyone listening. But yeah, like, I've had that evolution that you sort of spoken about through probably talking about drugs and alcohol and substances from a public health perspective, and thinking about the whole and health promotion rather than just the individual experience, you know. And I used to have this notion and this way that I would talk about myself, that, you know, I was an addict and all this stuff, right? And that's kind of transformed and evolved and changed. And it's been majorly freeing and changed a lot of different areas of my life. Like, how does that, and you know, you mentioned something that's really interesting. I've said it on podcasts before, and we've had such a jarring response, you know, that people can socially use substances and not get into trouble, and people can actually socially use the full spectrum of substances. How far away do you think we are from having that kind of accepted? Because that's what the data and the evidence actually shows and says. How far away are we having that accepted, and do you think that there is a pathway to having that included in our policy formation and the way that we publicly promote health in the substances space?
Look, when I'm feeling really optimistic, it feels like it's 5 minutes from now. But then the reality that always comes home to haunt me is that the status quo isn't something that just magically happens. It is something that our systems work to actively uphold. So, you know, sometimes when you, in those public policy conversations, try to assert that we should be prioritising harm reduction over this idea that we can stop everyone from using a particular substance, there will be people in the room who will have a reaction to that. And the reaction will probably be something like, oh, but, you know, my minister doesn't want to be the person who's seen to be encouraging people to use drugs. It always comes back to this idea that people are looking to government for their advice on this stuff, as opposed to, I mean, I live in a world where I'm pretty confident that everybody who wants to use drugs in this country is.
Yeah.
I might be wrong. There might be 2 or 3 people who are like, oh, I wish I knew someone who could sell me some drugs, and then don't act on that. Fine. So, I mean, if the reality that I live in is, well, I care about those people. So if I know something that might mean that they are less likely to experience problems with their substance use, then I'm all for giving that information. It's interesting, isn't it? Because when we have a drug panic, this is where we usually go off the rails. And the drug panic almost always starts with teachers and parents concerned about the children in the schools.
Yeah.
And the children in the schools are always not paying attention or engaging in their classes. And the answer to that is because of, in this instance, the most latest iteration, it's the vaping. So it's the nicotine addiction. That means they can't sit still in the class and do as they're told.
And that's what
and you're not allowed to say, Yeah, yeah. And when you ask the question, have the teachers tried being more interesting? Maybe that might be better. That's not, like that's not the answer. Um, so the question becomes then, so you can get all the health and the law enforcement people lined up and agreeing on, oh yeah, we don't want to criminalize people for vaping, but there will always be this uneducated community a response that says, oh, we don't like that, we want it to stop. And then politicians will go, well, now I feel caught in a bind because I want to be seen to be responding to my community. And I don't know enough about this stuff myself to be able to carry that conversation back to my constituents and have it on a one-on-one basis. When government wants to make policy change, they will, and they take it to an election. That's what they do. They brief all their MPs and they go back to their communities so that they can say to, Rebecca Lang, who's like, why isn't government doing more about whatever my particular hobby horse is? They've got a line they can give back. That stands up to the follow-up questions. And we haven't yet, because substance use is still amongst such a small amount of the population, I just feel like there's not enough empathy in the community to sustain a critical mass, which is why cannabis is going to be so important, because there's, about 15% of the population uses cannabis in any given year. So if all of those current illicit cannabis market users step out into the light, either through getting prescribed cannabis or because we make it legal, then that will change. People will know people who use drugs. It will seem less scary. We can shift this conversation. I hope that happens in my life. That's my goal. I want to make that happen in my lifetime.
Yeah, that's awesome. And so with cannabis, is there, we've been talking about the policy approaches that we've had with tobacco. Is there anything that you would change to what they've done in America? Is there, it's probably a bit of a leading question, but less commercialization of products and things like that?
Yeah, I think that you've got like the low dose stuff. I think you just let 1,000 flowers bloom. If it's less than sort of 5% THC content, then I wouldn't really be worrying too much about it.
Yeah.
Because that's what we're seeing a lot of it's where you've got higher dose availability. That's when we need to be a little more careful, because people can get into trouble a little more quickly. I think what the ones that have worked best in the States are ones that have prioritised social justice and restorative justice. So obviously, going back to the fact that our justice system is not equally applied across the population, there are lots of people whose employment and financial opportunities have been cut off because they've collected a drug possession charge or conviction. So New York prioritised the first group of licenses they granted were for people who had those experiences, because that then recognised this was a financial opportunity for those communities. So it was a bit of restorative justice.
Yeah.
I think keeping big business out of this stuff is good, because anywhere you've got a product that that has a downside, you don't want big business being the ones who decide what's available. Whether those big businesses
because they will fucking exploit the weak points. They will.
Oh, of course they will. I mean, the alcohol industry, I was talking to Katerina Georgi from the Foundation for Alcohol Research and Education last week, and apparently the 80% of the alcohol sold in this country is sold to like 10% of the drinkers.
Yeah.
And the alcohol companies kind of know who their market is, and they know how much they want you to drink each day so that they can turn over the profits that they've got. So yeah, I mean, maybe individuals working for them care about people, but as an entity, those entities don't show any particular care for their markets.
And just so everyone knows, like, I like to think of myself as pretty libertarian with all this stuff, and am for, in a lot of ways, the commercialization of this stuff. But it's interesting through some of the public health councils that I've been on, through people like FAIR and stuff like that, when they come back and expose some of the tactics, it's actually fucking disgraceful what the alcohol industry does. It's really bad. It's really bad. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, they advertise sugary alcoholic drinks next to schools, and they go, what do you mean? We're not targeting at children. You're like,
That's right.
I know you're not targeting at me.
The one that really grinded my gears was a year ago or a couple of years ago, when they were trying to open that Dan Murphy's in close to the Aboriginal dry community, and everybody in the community was like, we don't want it. And then they was still just trying to force it through and open it. Stuff like that. So yeah, I definitely think like when cannabis rolls around, I hope it gets rolled out on some form of a commercial level, but I'm probably with you that there's some regulation that prevents things like that happening, or there's like some other structure that doesn't fall
In a
into the
sense,
hands of those businesses.
that's already happening.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, you look at most of the medicinal cannabis market is separate to the regular GP market. Most people aren't going to their GP to get their medicinal cannabis. They're going to a medicinal cannabis prescriber. Here in Queensland, you do pay $80, you do your online telehealth consultation, and then you receive your product in the post. And the risk with that one is that it seems like we're developing these ones where the people who are doing the prescribing are also producing the product. So the only thing they're prescribing is their own product, which, is not how the rest of the health system, okay, I need to take that back, because it is kind of how the rest of the health system works as well. Like the pharmaceutical rep will come to the GP and say, this is a really great new blood pressure medication or whatever, and the GP's behaviour will change and stuff. But the GP is not financially benefiting most of the time from that arrangement. Whereas if I'm selling you the product and making the money on the pharmaceutical, I shouldn't be allowed to also prescribe it to you.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that some of those basic kind of, it's just your basic corruption risk mitigation, right? Because if you keep the parts of the system separate, then you minimise the risk of corrupt individuals or corrupt organisations trying to make lots of money and not giving a damn about the misery they might cause on the way through.
Yeah. So from where you're sitting, you sit in a role where you get to advocate for policy and things like this. And as you said, you're pretty interested in cannabis. And it's interesting given everything that's happening with tobacco and the policy discussion around that at the moment. Like how far, I don't know if you said it before, how far away do you think Australia is off having it rolled out in closer to what's happened in America, or in a bigger way with cannabis? Do you think it's far away?
Yeah, it's tricky because usually in the States, most of the jurisdictions have these, if you get enough signatures, you can get an item on the ballot and kind of direct your local lawmakers to make a law about it. So that's how most of the cannabis law reform in the States has happened, is, people who use cannabis getting together, getting all the community to sign on, and then petitioning their local, goes on the ballot with the local election. And then if 90% of people vote yes for it, then the politicians really have no choice but to progress it. So most of the cannabis reform in the States has been kind of not led by government, it's been led by the people. And I suppose you could argue that's the same thing that's happened here with particularly now I've forgotten the lady's name. She did a lot of really great work because her son had a horrible form of cancer, and cannabis was the only thing that helped him kind of have any quality of life while he was, so he could sleep, he could eat, he could have some kind of quality of life. And that was enough to connect with it. So we have to connect with empathy in our political class to get movement. The trickier part again then is that each state and territory will make their own decisions. I mean, I live in Queensland, so maybe I probably have better visibility over the conversation here than I do in other parts of the country. But we also have about 50% of the prescriptions for medicinal cannabis are prescribed in Queensland. So it turns out Queenslanders love cannabis. And so I feel like that starts to shift the equation, because people know someone who I can't tell you the number of times I run into someone and they tell me about their mum's best friend who's using cannabis for her, her cancer, or someone else who's using it for their anxiety, or someone else who's using it to help them sleep, and how it's changed their lives. And the doctors keep telling me there's no evidence that THC is good for pain, but lots of people tell me that it's changed their lives around pain and they're no longer taking opioids. So I feel like the first thing we need is a good regulatory structure for this, and then I feel like Queensland's going to go first, like with drug checking in a permanent way, because we've got a critical mass of good policymakers
Sorry, we're on a delay. Finish.
You find it weird, don't you? Because Queensland's supposed.
Yeah, that's what I was going to
I was
say.
just going to say,
Oh, we're on a delay, but that's what I was going to say, which is it's interesting because from what I know, correct me if I'm wrong, legally, Queensland's probably one of the heavier hands when it comes to drug and alcohol possession, or the what's criminalised. I could be wrong, but I'm pretty sure that's right.
I don't know what you mean, Jack. 63,000 offences charged last financial year. Sure. No. Queensland, you're right. We arrest and charge people for drug possession at a rate twice that of any other jurisdiction in the nation.
Yeah.
And most of that is incidental. So we have expanded police diversion coming out in May. It'll be implemented. And the thing that I'm doing to work towards that is working really hard to frame that up for police as this is about police behaviour change, not about people's drug use. So the change, it acknowledges that there's not a lot of value to the people the police interact with or to the community in detecting people for small amounts of drugs possession. And so we're trying to disincentivise cops from engaging with people. Unfortunately, we have cross-purposes things that go on up here, like there's a new thing they're doing where they're wanding the children in public places to see if they're carrying knives. Turns out almost none of them are carrying knives, but some of them are carrying drugs. And so that behaviour change piece is going to be quite tough for us. But at the same time, police here say that they understand, like our police commissioner is a fan of expanding diversion and is looking forward to evaluating its impact so that then we can take the next step in a couple of years' time towards more, I guess, an ACT decriminalised model. So I think, the problem for the ACT is that there are trailblazers in policy quite often, but people don't usually pay too much attention because they're a highly educated population and it's a very small jurisdiction. So Queensland's not taking the ACT's advice because we're so giant. It's hard to kind of see how how it'll come across. So this is the dichotomy that I live in. On the one hand, you've got we arrest a lot of people. On the other hand, it's really easy to have political conversations across the political spectrum where people will say, oh yeah, no, legal cannabis is coming. Most often they see it as a tax benefit for the state, but the real benefit will be we'll have all these police resources we can redeploy to something else because they're not arresting people for drugs.
Yeah.
So yeah, fingers crossed.
Yeah.
Fingers crossed. And sometimes I think the more extreme your policing response is, the harder it is for the public health people or the public policy people to turn a blind eye to that. Because, we like to think that the system works pretty well most of the time, and our drug policing system up here is busted. It's so busted.
Yeah. Yeah. It's really interesting. Like Queensland, I was saying this to someone the other day on a podcast, even from when I was using drugs, it was like a known thing, even just with like cannabis, people would be like, be fucking careful when you buy chuff up in Queensland, or like if you're on the Gold Coast at a holiday, because if you get caught with it, like, it was like a well-known thing that you get in trouble. So it's really interesting. So you're talking about all these things. I think you might be, or you might not be. You might be surprised because you talk about this stuff all day, but people would find it highly fascinating. Because I remember when I first started having these conversations, I was like, oh wow, this is how it all works and happens. How do people, if they're listening to this, and maybe they're not in like a policy-facing job where they can have conversations with people about this stuff, how would you advise people to get involved to, try and be part of the conversation or try and be an agent of change? Sounds so corny saying that, but like how do people get involved in this stuff?
So there's a few different ways. I mean, if you are a person who uses drugs and that's an important thing to you, then every state and territory has a drug user organisation who is trying to bring the lived experience perspective into this conversation. So you could definitely hook up with your local drug user org. There are a couple of policy sort of think tanky type things that are available in Australia. You can sign up to their mailing list. So there's the two that I think of are the um, Drug Policy Australia, and there's another one called Unharm, and they kind of are more kind of campaign-driven organisations that seek to put forward that kind of alternative view. If you wanted to do it in a less organised way, write to your local member and just let them know that, you know, you're not okay with the current situation. And keep your eye on when these things come up in the media is a really good time to hit your local member up for their view on it. Because, you know, the nature of today's politics is that it is driven by the news cycle. So if you see what I do is if I see an article on like cannabis reform, or I saw an article last week on like a high visibility policing operation on reducing youth crime, making the community feel safe. And the journo told a story about how they stopped a kid at a bus stop and they wanted him and he didn't have anything, and then he wouldn't turn out his pockets. Turns out he had weed in his pockets. And how they bundled him into the back of the unmarked police car and took him off. And I forwarded that to an advisor, and I was like, is this a good use of our resources? You know. So picking up on, like, that's the way the system will respond, is if enough people poke it in enough different places that, you know, your local member goes to talk to someone else's local member, and then they all go talk to Mark Butler, and Mark Butler goes, lots of people are talking about wanting to see this change, then, or at least to not see a punitive response. I think that's step one, is to get them to back away from the punishment model. And then two is the, well, what else kind of model. So, but yeah, there's plenty. Just get on your computer and Google my jurisdiction and drug stuff, and a bunch of good organisations doing good work will pop up, and you'll find one that is your tribe. And then, you know, there are a million ways to contribute.
Yeah, awesome. Hey, highly interesting. Thank you very much for tackling, you know, the hot topic of the policy at the moment. Is there anything? Probably not. Maybe, I don't know. Is there anything that you want to promote? We have a varying audience. Is there anything that you guys are doing work-wise at the moment that is interesting? I'm sure it's all.
We've got our conference coming up in August.
Sorry.
Of course, but of particular interest to people who are listening to this podcast or watching this podcast, we've got our conference on in August. It's called Winter School. It's the 21st to the 23rd of August, and I'm pretty excited. We've got the North Carolina Survivors Union coming out to do. They're running this thing they're calling a narco-feminist storytelling project, where people tell their lived experience, but from a structural perspective. So that the system, instead of just hearing people's bad news stories, the system hears what I could be doing differently to support people who need help.
That's interesting.
Plus, there'll be a bunch of other really current content. Yeah, it's a bit different. I saw them in Europe last year and was like, come to Queensland. So I'm pretty excited about those. We've just launched the conference last week, so get along and have a look.
And just so that everybody knows, that is a quality conference. Like last year, you had Dr. Carl Hart, who's pretty... That's his name, right? Yeah, who's pretty famous.
Yeah, that's right.
It's a very interesting conference.